Welcome to MLT 101, Introduction to Lab Safety. My name is H1 Barnes. Starting with general lab safety. Key elements to have a safe lab include a formal safety program, documented policies, and chemical hygiene plan, a control of exposure to bloodborne pathogens plan, a tuberculosis control plan, and an ergonomics plan. You'll also need to identify specific occupational hazards for your lab. Typically, that will include biological, chemical, electrical, and fire hazards. All of these will need to be clearly identified and have a documented policy for employees to read and learn on how to deal with each of these hazards. In addition to that, you'll need to plan for relevant safety areas of concern, including but not limited to effective waste management, because some of the byproducts of the laboratory work that we do are, I'm not going to say toxic waste, but are not the kind of stuff that you can just dump down the sink. There are specific ways they have to be packaged and distributed out to the waste management section in the hospital. Of specific concern for microbiology laboratories is bioterrorism surveillance. There is what's called the Laboratory Response Network in the United States, where many of us, it's about 1,000 labs last time I checked, work together and train to learn how to identify the signs of bioterrorism attacks, such as the presence of organisms like anthrax or plague or Francisella. The big scary stuff that people worry about, we train how to actually detect. And what to do in the case of detecting or not being able to prove that something isn't one of those potential bioterror agents. You also have to worry about chemical terrorism and have a response plan for that as well. Every clinical lab will have a comprehensive formal safety program that is not optional, regardless of the size of the clinical lab, even if it's just you, yourself, and you manning that laboratory. If you're one of one, you still have to have a formalized safety program, which will have a safety officer or a chair for your safety committee who is given the responsibility to implement and maintain the safety program. It is each and every employee's responsibility to work safely in the lab. A lab is a safe environment to work in when you do so safely. As long as you follow your safety policies, it is a perfectly safe place to work. The moment that somebody stops abiding by those safety regulations is when people can contract diseases that can kill them or infect them for life and cripple them. You pour the wrong things down the sink, might be fine the first dozen times, and then on time 17, the sink blows up like a pipe bomb and takes out your knees because it builds up a toxic residue over time that you just now found out explodes when contact with water. That's why we have to read these safety policies so that things like that don't happen. The responsibility for the safety program begins with the facility and laboratory leadership. All new employees will be given a copy of the General Lab Safety Manual as part of new employee orientation. And it should highlight and bring attention to things like the proper labeling of the chemicals you work with, what type of fire extinguisher you have and where they're located, and how to use them properly. Different types of fire extinguishers are used differently. The safety hoods that you have, where they're at, how to use them, and how to make sure that they're in good working order. The proper grounding of your electrical equipment, any ergonomics issues that you may have in the lab. This is of special note in areas that have a high amount of repetitive motion, such as a high throughput serology and immunology lab environment, or a manual molecular diagnostics lab, where a large amount of pipetting is done in a repetitive motion manner. I bring this up specifically because I know people that have had to get surgery for repetitive motion injury from working in these areas because they did the same pipetting motion with their shoulder and their hands hundreds of times a day for years. In that kind of circumstance, you want to rotate people around so no one person undergoes too much bodily strain, or redesign the process if possible to eliminate the bodily strain entirely. You also need to discuss the proper handling and disposal of biohazardous materials. Some of the safety equipment that you're going to have in your lab is an eye wash or face washing station, which will be available in every lab. Oftentimes, the lab is the best known location of the eye washing station, and other people from around the facility will know for sure that you have one, but they don't know where their own is, and they may actually come all the way across the building to use your eye washing station. That's how well known it is that labs maintain their safety equipment. Every lab is also going to have a safety shower. It needs to be located centrally in the lab. I need to make sure you have a way to drain that thing, because it's going to put out a lot of water very quickly, and you don't want it to flood the laboratory environment with the chemicals that you are washing off of someone in the act of showering. This equipment needs to be tested on a regular basis. Frequently, it's tested on a weekly basis for your eye washing stations. Employees need to know the location of these, and you need to teach them, when you bring them in board your lab, how to use the safety shower and the eye wash station. In the event of a chemical spill or a splash to the eye or other body parts, typically you are going to wash that body part, flush it with water for a minimum of 15 minutes. After you use the eye wash or safety shower, then you're going to report to the emergency room for further evaluation. If that person is not in danger, their supervisor should also be notified, and the event will be documented based on your laboratory policies. Something to keep in mind is that safety goggles, glasses, and visors, including some that can fit over your regular eyeglasses, are available in many sizes and shapes. Personnel that wear contact lenses should be aware of the danger of wearing contact lenses in the laboratory. It is a bad idea to wear contact lenses in the laboratory, especially if you are working in microbiology. It is highly recommended to switch from contact lenses to regular glasses when you are working in the lab. And wearing contact lenses can make it difficult to flush your eyes properly. You're also going to have spill kits for acids, caustic materials, or flammable solvents. Such kits are commonly made out of things like dry kitty litter and a broom and a dustpan. You want to know where they're at, because if you spill something that is dangerous, you need to be able to respond immediately. Special EPA-approved kits, that's Environmental Protection Agency, are available for cleanup of blood and other body fluids and disinfecting surfaces. Typically, if someone spills a small amount of blood, they're going to clean it up either with a cavicide or a bleach wipe. Commonly, blood in the laboratory is cleaned up with a mixture of 10% bleach using the spray, wait, wipe technique. You'll spray it with bleach, wait 2 to 3 minutes, wipe it up, and then rinse it twice with a wet cloth that's been moistened with water. Just bleach on its own will leave a corrosive residue that can cause things to break down over time if you don't clean it off. Gloves have to be worn during this process. Cleanup procedures vary slightly based off the type and size of spill, but should concentrate on absorbing material without spreading it over a wider area than the original spill. Disposable materials will be discarded in a biohazard waste container. Reusable materials should be disinfected after use. A chemical fume hood is a necessity for every clinical chemistry lab. The fume hood is your only safe location to open a container that's giving off harmful vapors, to prepare reagents that produce fumes, and to heat flammable solvents. Closing the window on that hood can contain a potential fire that comes from those solvents. In the US, there are several regulatory, private accreditation, state, and federal organizations that will conduct safety inspections in your lab. Some of these safety inspections are unannounced. You are not always going to know that you're going to be having an inspection. These include OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They can enter your clinical lab unannounced, and as long as they present their credentials proving that they are from OSHA, they can inspect your lab. OSHA is not going to come in and inspect how you are doing science. OSHA is going to come in and inspect whether or not you are doing science safely. They are not meant to be the technical experts on the process of running an RPR or how to detect glucose in somebody's blood. They're there to make sure that you're not exposing people to that blood and putting them at risk of a bloodborne pathogen exposure. Things like that. This inspection may be a regular inspection, or it can be as the result of a complaint. Someone could let them know that the laboratory is not performing work safely, and OSHA will come by to verify that claim. The big one for the laboratory is the College of American Pathologists. The College of American Pathologists is our accrediting agency. It is the end-all, be-all for how we think of whether or not it's a good lab. They're designed for pathology and laboratory services only. They conduct scheduled and unannounced laboratory inspections, and they're the ones that do our proficiency testing. That is a regular type of testing where the College of American Pathologists will send us a set of samples. We test it on our machines with our methods and report to them the results we got. They will then tell us whether or not we got those answers correct. It's a way that we can show and demonstrate to ourselves and to the accrediting agency that we are doing things correctly and we are getting and reporting the answers that we should be getting and reporting. College of American Pathologists is the one that says, yes, our lab is doing medical science properly. When a CAP team comes and inspects your lab, it is done by another CAP lab. If you are accredited through CAP, and everybody calls them CAP, if you are accredited through CAP, your lab will provide inspectors to inspect other local labs and other local labs in your area. It might be the lab a city over or 2 hours drive away. Will provide inspectors to come inspect your lab. CAP will give them a checklist of items they're looking for, and other laboratory scientists, other people who work in the lab at a different lab, will come and inspect your lab because they're the people that know what they're doing and know what they're looking for. It is a peer-to-peer inspection system where we inspect each other and hold each other accountable. This means that even though the world of medical science is very technical and can be highly complex, especially for people who are not familiar with it, when CAP comes to inspect your lab, you are getting inspectors who know what they're doing and they know what they're looking for. These are not people where you just brush something under the rug and they look and say everything looks nice and they walk away. They are going to come into your lab with a book-sized inspection sheet and go down item by item. This inspection can take days or even a week or more, going through hundreds of individual inspectable items for each section of your laboratory. It is incredibly thorough. It is thorough to the point that when the Joint Commission comes by to inspect the rest of the hospital, Joint Commission, JCO, can come up to your lab, look at the sign next to your lab door that says you're accredited by CAP and this is when you passed the last inspection, and just check a box on their sheet and continue on. They don't even have to step inside your laboratory. They can just say, yep, they passed CAP, they're good to go. Because CAP is the most intense, rigorous accreditation inspection you're going to see anywhere outside of the nuclear field. However, they may still choose, JCO may still choose to conduct a safety inspection of your lab, even though you've passed CAP. They're going to come in and look for things to make sure that you've got fire extinguishers, that your safety shower works, that you have safety data sheets, that kind of thing. JCO can conduct a scheduled or an unannounced inspection, which may include a full laboratory or laboratory safety component. State or local health departments and fire department inspections may also be made on a regular basis to determine that you are conforming to those particular local safety requirements. Your lab is required to have a chemical hygiene plan, a CHP. Major elements of this will include a listing of the responsibilities for the employer, the facility you work at, and for the employees who work there. It's going to include safety data sheets for every hazardous chemical stored or used in your lab. These used to be called MSDSs, Material Safety Data Sheets. If you see that term used, that means you have outdated references. They are now called SDSs. A copy of the SDS, the safety data sheet, has to be on file and readily accessible, available to every employee working in the lab 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and ideally they should be centrally located, easy to find and reference, so that they are at a fingertips distance away in case something goes wrong. Because not everything can be dealt with a 15-minute flush of the eyes with water. That's a good catch-all initial strategy, but it does not work for everything. And your SDS is going to tell you when that's not an acceptable plan. Your SDS is going to contain the following information. It'll define all of your chemicals as toxic, carcinogenic, or dangerous. It'll include the chemical's manufacturer information, which can be used to ascertain whether a certain chemical is hazardous. It'll also include fire and explosion hazard data and health-related data. This is important because there are some chemicals that we work with that are volatile, and they will evaporate into the air. These highly reactive chemicals, if they are exposed to a flame, can explode. A lot of laboratories have to maintain a certain humidity level because of this. Having a certain level of humidity in the air will prevent these chemicals from evaporating into dry air. If they evaporate into dry air and fill the room with flammable fumes, that can cause an explosion or a fire. Your SDS is going to be one of the sources of data that will help you prevent that from happening. Each SDS must give the product's identity as it appears on the container label and the chemical and common names of the hazardous components. They will also provide information on spill and disposal procedures and what PPE you need to wear when you're handling that chemical. Your lab will also have an exposure plan, which will develop, implement, and ensure the protection of your lab's workers against potential exposure to a bloodborne pathogen. This is enforced by OSHA. When implementing this plan, each lab employee is going to be placed in one of three groups. You have Group 1, which is all of your employees that have occupational exposure to blood or other potentially infectious materials. This is basically everybody in your lab who is doing actual hands-on scientific work. If you are working with body fluids, you are working with biohazard, you're going to be in this group. The majority of people are. Then you have Group 2, which are some employees have occupational exposure to blood or other potentially infectious materials. Then you have Group 3. No employees have occupational exposure to blood or other potentially infectious materials. Your exposure plan is going to document and be used to enforce some of the general safety rules in your lab, which are things like no eating, drinking, smoking, or chewing gum in the lab. That is an industry standard. You are not going to be doing those things in any lab that you ever work in. No mouth pipetting. That is very officially banned. That is not okay. That is not allowed. That's something that people used to do 100 years ago, back before we had advanced automated equipment to do it for us. But it is incredibly dangerous for someone to mouth pipette body fluids because of the risk of exposure to things like hepatitis B or HIV. Do not place your pens or pencils in your mouth. Keep your nails short and well manicured and don't bite them. Having really long nails in the lab is not safe. Don't apply cosmetics in the lab. That includes chapstick, lip balm, lotions, things like that. You don't want to touch your face when you're in the lab. You're not going to take your lab PPE outside of the lab because hypothetically, it could be contaminated. Even if you've been very careful all day long, you cannot prove that your PPE is not contaminated, so you do not wear it outside the lab. If you're going to leave the lab, you take off your coat, you take off your mask and your gloves. And if you have long hair and you're working in the lab, you're going to tie that hair back. You do not want to lean forward and have your hair dip down into an open tube of sputum. That is mucus, that is snot that someone coughed up out of their lungs, and now it's in your hair. You don't want that to happen. Regardless of an exposure route, your exposure plan will require that all exposures have immediate attention. Whether it's in the eye, the ear, the mouth, the nose, it's a needle stick, they all have to be reported and documented immediately, starting with a report to your immediate supervisor. This is going to ensure that exposed individuals report directly to a licensed healthcare provider for a medical evaluation and treatment immediately following that. Or if it is a potentially dangerous stick, they're going to do that before they report to their supervisor. You can call your supervisor using the phone on the other side of the facility after you check yourself into the ER. You're also going to have a log for employee percutaneous injuries from sharp devices, such as needles or glass or anything like that. CAP requires that your lab has a documented tuberculosis control plan. It conforms to biosafety guidelines published by the CDC. The purpose of this plan is to prevent the transmission of tuberculosis, also known as TB. Tuberculosis isn't that common in the United States, but if you leave the US, it becomes very common in the rest of the world. It is massively prevalent in other countries. An effective tuberculosis control plan will include a determination of exposure at regular intervals for all employees who could be at occupational risk, and the implementation of engineering and work practice controls in the name of preventing an exposure. Your lab will also have an ergonomics program. There are several areas of occupational risk to develop musculoskeletal disorders in the clinical lab, because some people will hunch over when they're at a microscope, having an awkward posture, causing strain on their back or their knees. I mentioned it before, but repetitive motion is a big one for the laboratory, and the repeated use of force. CAP requires accredited labs to have a comprehensive and well-defined ergonomics program to prevent these kind of injuries and disorders. The idea is that you prevent them. You don't treat them, you prevent them in the first place. Ideally, through designing your processes and your lab tests, you pick your equipment, you design your laboratory in a manner that reduces the need for an awkward posture and reduces the need for repetitive motions in the first place. Failing that, if you can't do those things, then you train your staff on ways that they can mitigate that risk to themselves, and periodically assess the processes that your employees go through to see if there is now a new and better option which can reduce or eliminate the need for repetitive motions in one of those laboratory tests that's being performed. To identify hazards in your clinical lab, look for things under the categories of biological, chemical, radiation, electrical, and fire. Not every medical lab is going to have radiation hazards. Primarily, that's a blood banking thing where radiation is used to kill rapidly dividing cells before a unit of blood is transfused to an immunocompromised person. Most other areas of the lab will not have to worry about radiation safety. That is primarily for blood banking. These hazards must be identified and labeled, and work practices must be developed for dealing with them. They cannot just be left ambiguous. Within the major categories, there are 9 classes of hazardous materials as classified by the UN, the United Nations. We have explosives, compressed gases, flammable liquids, flammable solids, oxidizer materials, toxic materials, radioactive materials, corrosive materials, and miscellaneous materials not elsewhere classified. Warning labels are going to aid in the identification of these chemical hazards. OSHA prescribes the use of labels or other appropriate warnings. There is no single uniform labeling system for all hazardous chemicals in clinical labs. Every individual chemical manufacturer is going to make their own label that they're putting on the chemicals they send you. There are a few standard things, such that all labels are going to list the name of the reagent that is in that container. They're going to list the concentration of the reagent that is in that container, any storage requirements for storing its safety, the date that that chemical was made or when it was put into use, the date that chemical expires. And you yourself will initial it when you first open that container. So that is how you get the date of when it was placed into use. You'll write the date that you open that bottle, and you'll initial that bottle as open. You can also commercially purchase labels or create your own labels as long as they meet all these requirements. They can be handwritten or printed as long as they're legible to read. Appropriate hazard warnings are going to include any words, pictures, symbols, or combination of the above that will convey the health or physical hazards of the container's contents. You need to be as specific as possible as how that chemical is going to affect a person's body and the organs that that chemical is going to target with its effect. Per the Department of Transportation, the DOT, chemicals that are transported in the United States have to carry labels based on the UN classification system. If you work in the specimen processing or mailouts section of a laboratory, this becomes especially relevant. Department of Transportation placards or labels are diamond-shaped and will have a digit printed on the bottom corner to identify the UN hazard class, 1 through 9. 3 of the quadrants have a characteristic color and represent a type of hazard. The 4th, lower quadrant, will contain information of special interest to firemen in accordance with the National Fire Protection Association, NAFPA. These labels are color-coded with a picture in the top corner of the diamond. We'll supplement that hazard information on the label. The red quadrant represents fire hazard and flammability. The blue quadrant represents health hazards. The yellow is chemical reactivity, and when I say that, think of something's ability to blow up, to explode violently. And the white quadrant is for special hazards. These quadrants are also going to be labeled with a number. The higher the number, the more dangerous the chemical contained within, going all the way up to the number 4. A chemical, for example, that has a fire hazard of 4 is something that could spontaneously burst into flames at room temperature without you having to light it on fire. It can just catch on fire on its own. Something that has a flammability hazard of 1 might not catch on fire until it gets near to the boiling temperature of water, or you might need to actually go out of your way to light it on fire to do that. Be very careful when you see chemicals that have these high numbers for their hazard warnings. That's not something to just deal with casually. They go from 0 all the way up to 4. A material that's rated at 0 for a blue health hazard is something that on exposure under fire conditions would offer no hazard beyond that of ordinary combustible materials. A health hazard of 4 is something that on very short exposure could cause death or major residual injury, even though prompt medical treatment is given. A fire hazard, a color red code of 0, is something that just doesn't burn. Imagine just trying to light a cup of water on fire. It's not going to burn. A 4 in that category is a material that will rapidly or completely vaporize at atmospheric pressure and normal ambient temperature, or that are readily dispersed in the air and that will burn readily. All it takes is one spark, and that thing's going to burst into flames. The reactivity code, stability, the yellow code. 0 is a material that in themselves are normally stable, even under fire exposure conditions, and that are not reactive with water. You can get it wet safely, you can light it on fire, and it's not going to blow up. Something that's got a 4, keep in mind this goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, in order of increasing risk or hazard. A 4 in reactivity is a material that in themselves are readily capable of detonation or of explosive decomposition or reaction at a normal temperature or pressure.